Step into the art of Poirot, where Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot masters the craft of mystery. In the shadowed halls of Blackthorn Hall, a grand masquerade turns deadly. A playwright is found murdered, a silver letter opener in his heart, a poisoned glass by his side. Who among the glittering guests hides a killer's secret? Was it the fragile heiress, haunted by her past, the charming financier with debts unpaid, or the elegant hostess guarding a scandal that could ruin her? Hercule Poirot, with his little grey cells, unravels a web of lies, where every clue, a green silk thread, a forged note, leads to a shocking truth. Will you guess the killer before the final twist? Chapter 1. The Gathering at Blackthorn Hall. In the waning days of October, when the leaves of Devon turned crimson and gold, Blackthorn Hall stood as a sentinel of grandeur against the rolling moors. The ancient manor, with its ivy-clad towers and mullioned windows, exuded an air of faded opulence, as though it clung to secrets it could no longer afford to keep. It was here, in this remote corner of England, that Lady Beatrice Ashburn had summoned a peculiar assembly for what she termed a celebration of autumn's mysteries. The invitation, penned in her elegant hand, promised an evening of intellectual discourse, fine dining, and a touch of the theatrical, a Hallowe'en masquerade to stir the imagination. Yet, beneath the veneer of festivity, there lingered an undercurrent of unease, as if the very walls of Blackthorn Hall anticipated the tragedy to come. Captain Arthur Hastings, ever the loyal companion of Hercule Poirot, had received his own invitation through a curious twist of fate. Lady Beatrice, an old acquaintance from his days in London society, had insisted he attend, hinting at matters of some delicacy that required a discreet observer. Hastings, never one to resist the lure of a country house gathering, had persuaded Poirot to join him, though the little Belgian detective was less than enthused about leaving the comforts of his London flat for what he called the barbaric wilderness of the moors. "Mon ami," Poirot had said, adjusting his impeccable moustache as they boarded the train to Devon, "I do not care for these rustic affairs. The country air, it is too, how do you say, unrefined for the little grey cells. But if there is intrigue, as you suggest, then perhaps Hercule Poirot shall find some amusement." The train had deposited them at a small wind-swept station, where a chauffeur in a sleek Bentley awaited to convey them to Blackthorn Hall. As they approached, the manor loomed out of the mist, its silhouette both majestic and foreboding. The gravel drive crunched. An elegant chignon and her emerald gown shimmered as she moved. She clasped Hastings' hand with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Captain Hastings, how delightful! And Monsieur Poirot, an unexpected honor," she said, her voice smooth as velvet. "I trust you'll find our little gathering stimulating." Poirot inclined his head, his eyes already scanning the room with the precision of a jeweler inspecting a diamond. "Madame, I am always intrigued by the complexities of human nature. This evening, I suspect, will provide much to ponder." The other guests were an eclectic mix, each introduced with a flourish by Lady Beatrice. There was Sir Reginald Carver, a retired barrister with a penchant for brandy and a booming laugh that masked a shrewd intellect. His wife, Clara, was a quiet woman whose nervous glances suggested she was ill at ease in her husband's shadow. Next came Dr. Malcolm Everett, a psychiatrist with a penchant for cryptic remarks and an unsettling habit of staring too long into one's eyes. His companion, Miss Eleanor Price, was a young novelist whose sharp wit and guarded demeanor hinted at a mind as complex as her prose. Then there was Mr. Julian Trent, a financier whose slick charm and tailored suit did little to conceal a certain predatory air. Beside him stood his fiancée, Miss Violet Marlowe, a delicate beauty with porcelain skin and a haunted expression, as though she carried a weight she dared not share. Rounding out the party was Mrs. Dorothea Lang, an eccentric widow with a fondness for spiritualism and a collection of garish rings that clinked as she gestured animatedly. The final guest, introduced with a touch of reverence, was Mr. Lawrence Gray, a reclusive playwright whose latest work, The Shadow's Veil, was the talk of London's literary circles. Gray was a man of middle years, with a gaunt face and eyes that seemed to see through the facade of polite society. His presence, Hastings noted, seemed to unsettle the others, though none would say why. Dinner was a lavish affair, served in a dining room adorned with portraits of Ashbourne ancestors whose stern gazes seemed to judge the proceedings. The conversation flowed as freely as the wine, touching on literature, politics, and the occult, a nod to the Hallowe'en theme. Yet Hastings could not shake the feeling that each guest was performing, their words carefully chosen, their smiles a touch too brittle. "Tell me, Monsieur Gray," Poirot said, his voice cutting through the chatter like a scalpel. "This play of yours, The Shadow's Veil, it is said to be a study in betrayal, n'est-ce pas? Does it draw from life, or is it merely the product of a fertile imagination?" Gray's fork paused midway to his mouth, and for a moment his eyes locked with Poirot's. "Life, Monsieur Poirot."
Notice Clara Carver's hand tremble as she reached for her glass, and Violet Marlowe's gaze dropped to her plate. The air grew heavier, as if Gray's words had stirred something unspoken. As the meal concluded, Lady Beatrice rose, her smile radiant but strained. "My dear friends, the hour grows late, but the night is young. Shall we adjourn to the library for our masquerade? I've prepared a little game, a mystery to unravel, inspired by our theme of secrets and shadows." The guests followed her to the library, a cavernous room lined with leather-bound tomes and lit by a roaring fire. Masks were distributed, elaborate creations of feathers, velvet and gold, and the atmosphere grew charged with anticipation. Lady Beatrice explained the game. Each guest would share a secret about themselves, true or false, and the others would guess its veracity. It was meant to be light-hearted, but as the first secrets were shared, Hastings sensed a shift. Dr. Everett admitted to a fascination with the criminal mind. Miss Price hinted at a scandal in her past, and Mr. Trent spoke vaguely of debts unpaid. Each revelation seemed to peel back a layer of civility, exposing raw nerves. It was Lawrence Gray's turn that changed everything. He stood, his mask a stark black domino that accentuated his hollow cheeks, and said, "My secret is this. I know why one among us will not leave this house alive." A gasp rippled through the room. Lady Beatrice laughed, a touch too shrilly. "Oh, Lawrence, you do love the dramatic. It's only a game after all." But Gray's eyes were cold. "Is it, Beatrice? Some games have consequences." The fire crackled, and the shadows seemed to close in. Hastings glanced at Poirot, whose expression was unreadable, though his fingers drummed lightly on the arm of his chair, a sure sign his little grey cells were at work. As the clock struck 11, Lady Beatrice clapped her hands. Enough of secrets. Let us dance. Let us revel. The night is ours. The guests dispersed, some to the ballroom, where a gramophone played a haunting waltz, others to the terrace for air. Hastings lingered, watching Poirot, who remained seated, his eyes fixed on the doorway through which Gray had vanished. "Something troubles you, Poirot," Hastings ventured. "Oui, mon ami. The playwright, he speaks not of games, but of truths. And truths, when spoken in such a place as this, can be dangerous." The words hung in the air, and Hastings felt a chill that no fire could dispel.
Was marked by a strained festivity, as though the guests at Blackthorn Hall were determined to outrun the shadow he had cast. The ballroom, with its polished parquet floor and crystal chandelier, echoed with the strains of a gramophone waltz, but the dancers moved with a certain stiffness, their masked faces betraying flickers of unease. Captain Arthur Hastings, standing near the French doors that opened onto the terrace, sipped his brandy and observed the scene. The masks, he thought, were a poor disguise for the tension that simmered beneath the surface of this peculiar gathering. Hercule Poirot, ever the outsider, had declined to dance, preferring to ensconce himself in a velvet-upholstered chair by the fireplace. His small, neat figure was almost comical amidst the grandeur, yet his eyes, sharp and unyielding, missed nothing. He watched as Lady Beatrice glided among her guests, her laughter a touch too bright, her gestures a fraction too quick. Hastings, accustomed to Poirot's methods, knew that his friend was already cataloguing every word, every glance, every inconsistency. It was just past midnight when the scream shattered the illusion of merriment. It came from the direction of the library, a high, piercing cry that froze the dancers mid-step and silenced the gramophone. Hastings felt his heart lurch, and he turned to Poirot, who was already on his feet, his expression one of grim anticipation. "Mon ami," Poirot said, his voice low, "the game, it seems, has taken a darker turn." The guests surged toward the library, a chaotic procession of masked figures, their finery now incongruous against the rising panic. Hastings pushed through the crowd, Poirot at his side, and they reached the library to find a scene of horror. Lawrence Gray lay sprawled across the Persian rug, his black domino mask askew, revealing a face contorted in a final grimace of pain. A silver letter opener, its handle encrusted with garnets, protruded from his chest, and a dark stain spread across his white shirt front like an ink blot on a page. Lady Beatrice stood frozen near the fireplace, her hands pressed to her mouth, her emerald gown trembling as she stared at the body. Clara Carver let out a stifled sob, clinging to her husband's arm, while Dr. Malcolm Everett knelt beside Gray, his fingers probing for a pulse that was clearly absent. The other guests hovered at the threshold, their masks now discarded or pushed back, revealing expressions of shock, fear, and, in some cases, something harder to define. "Good heavens," Hastings whispered, his military instincts kicking in. "He's been murdered." Poirot's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the scene, his head tilted slightly, as though listening to a melody only he could hear. "Oui, Hastings, murdered, and in a manner most deliberate. Observe the letter opener, placed with precision, n'est-ce pas? This was no act of impulse." Dr. Everett rose, wiping his hands. "Dead," he said flatly. "Stabbed through the heart. Death would have been instantaneous." The room erupted into a cacophony of voices. Sir Reginald demanding to know who had last seen Gray alive, Mrs. Lang muttering about malevolent spirits, and Julian Trent calling for the police. Only Violet Marlowe remained silent, her pale face almost translucent in the firelight, her eyes fixed on the body as though it held some terrible secret. Lady Beatrice, recovering her composure, raised a hand for silence. "We must remain calm," she said, though her voice trembled. "The telephone lines are down, There was a storm earlier this evening. We cannot summon the police until morning. Until then, we must secure the scene." Poirot stepped forward, his presence commanding despite his diminutive stature. "Madam, if I may, Hercule Poirot is at your service. I propose that we preserve this room exactly as it is until the authorities arrive. But first, we must establish the facts. Who was last with Monsieur Gray?" The question hung in the air, and the guests exchanged uneasy glances. It was Miss Eleanor Price who spoke first, her voice sharp but controlled. "I saw him leave the ballroom about 20 minutes ago. He said he needed air and was going to the library to fetch a book." "And you, mademoiselle, did you follow him?" Poirot's tone was gentle, but his eyes were piercing. Eleanor flushed. "No, I stayed to dance with Mr. Trent. You can ask him." Trent nodded, though his expression was guarded. "That's right. Eleanor was with me until we heard the scream." Poirot turned to Lady Beatrice. "And you, madame, where were you at the time of this tragedy?" "I was in the ballroom, overseeing the refreshments," she replied, her chin lifting defiantly. "I had no reason to come to the library." One by one, the guests offered their alibis, each more carefully constructed than the last. Sir Reginald and Clara had been dancing together. Dr. Everett had stepped onto the terrace for a cigarette. Mrs. Lang claimed to have been consulting her tarot cards in the conservatory. And Violet Marlowe said she had been in the powder room, alone. Yet Poirot's expression remained inscrutable, his fingers steepled as he listened, as though each word were a piece of a puzzle he was already assembling in his mind. Hastings, meanwhile, was drawn to the details of the scene. The library was a large room, its walls lined with bookshelves that reached the ceiling, accessible by a rolling ladder. A heavy oak desk stood near the window, its surface cluttered with papers, an inkstand, and a half-empty glass of brandy. The letter opener, now embedded in Gray's chest, had clearly been taken from
The doors to the terrace. Someone could have entered from outside.
Poirot nodded, his eyes flicking to the doors.
Possible, mon ami, but unlikely. The terrace is overlooked by the ballroom, and the ground outside is soft from the rain. We shall examine it for footprints, but I suspect our killer is among us." He moved to the body, crouching with surprising agility for a man of his fastidious nature. He studied the letter opener, the angle of the wound, the position of Gray's hands, which were curled as though reaching for something just out of grasp. "Curieux," he murmured. "The wound is precise, the weapon driven with force. This suggests not only intent, but strength and, perhaps, anger." The guests were ushered out, save for Lady Beatrice, who insisted on staying. Poirot permitted it, though he watched her closely as he continued his inspection. He paused at the desk, lifting the brandy glass to his nose and sniffing delicately. "Brandy, oui, but there is something else. A faint bitterness. We must have this analyzed." Lady Beatrice paled. "You think he was poisoned?" "I think, madame, that nothing in this room is as it seems," Poirot replied. "Now, let us lock this door and ensure no one enters until the police arrive. Hastings, you will assist me in taking statements from each guest. We must know their movements, their motives, their secrets." As the guests dispersed, their voices hushed but urgent, Hastings felt the weight of the night settle over Blackthorn Hall. The masquerade was over, but the true masks, the ones woven from lies and hidden truths, remained firmly in place. Lawrence Gray's death was no random act. It was a calculated move in a game Poirot had yet to fully understand. But as Hastings followed his friend back to the ballroom, he knew one thing with certainty. Hercule Poirot's little grey cells were already at work, and no secret would remain hidden for long. Chapter 3. The Arrival of Poirot's Inquiry. The air in Blackthorn Hall had grown thick with suspicion as the guests were ushered from the library to the drawing-room, a stately chamber adorned with tapestries and heavy velvet drapes. The fire in the grate cast a flickering glow, but it did little to dispel the chill that had settled over the gathering. Lawrence Gray's murder had transformed the Hallowe'en masquerade into a grim tableau, and the guests, still in their
handkerchief, nor the subtle glance Julian Trent cast toward Violet Marlowe, nor the rigid posture of Lady Beatrice as she perched on the edge of a chaise longue. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, his voice calm but resonant, "a tragedy has occurred, and it is the task of Hercule Poirot to bring order to this chaos. A man is dead, murdered in a manner most deliberate. But fear not, where there is method, there is also reason, and reason shall lead us to the truth. I shall require your cooperation. Each of you will speak with me, and we shall establish the facts." A murmur rippled through the room, but none dared object. Poirot's reputation, though known only to a few in this company, carried a weight that silenced dissent. Lady Beatrice rose, her composure restored, though her eyes were shadowed with strain. "Monsieur Poirot, we are at your disposal. Where shall we begin?" Poirot inclined his head. "We begin, madame, with the timeline. The scream was heard at 12 minutes past midnight. Monsieur Gray was last seen alive, according to Mademoiselle Price, at approximately 20 minutes to midnight, when he left the ballroom for the library. This gives us a window of some 20 minutes during which the crime was committed. I shall speak with each of you in turn, and I ask that you remain here until called." He gestured to a small antechamber off the drawing-room, where a writing desk and 2 chairs awaited. "Captain Hastings, you will record the statements. Let us proceed with method and precision." The first to be interviewed was Lady Beatrice herself, who entered the antechamber with the grace of a hostess determined to maintain control. She sat, folding her hands in her lap, and met Poirot's gaze with a mixture of defiance and apprehension. "Madame," Poirot began, "you have been most gracious in hosting this gathering. Tell me, what was your connection to Monsieur Gray, and where were you between 11:30 and midnight?" Lady Beatrice's lips tightened briefly before she answered. "Lawrence was an old friend, though we had not seen each other in years until recently. His play, The Shadow's Veil, was causing quite a stir, and I thought it fitting to invite him to this literary-themed soirée. As for my whereabouts, I was in the ballroom, ensuring the guests were attended to. The servants can confirm I was there, overseeing the refreshments and speaking with Mr. Trent about his investments." Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. "And did you notice anything unusual about Monsieur Gray this evening? His words, perhaps, or his demeanor?" She hesitated, her fingers brushing the emerald brooch at her throat. "He was intense, as always. His remark about someone not leaving the house alive was unsettling, but I took it as theatricality. Lawrence Came Sir Reginald Carver, whose booming voice seemed subdued as he settled into the chair. His ruddy face was flushed,
though whether from brandy or nerves, Hastings could not tell. "Dreadful business, Poirot," he said, shaking his head. "Never thought I'd see a murder in a place like this." "Indeed, Sir Reginald," Poirot replied. "Tell me, where were you when the scream was heard?" "Dancing with Clara, my wife, in the ballroom. We'd been at it for a good half-hour, waltz after waltz. Beastly tiring, but she enjoys it. I didn't see Gray after dinner, though I heard him make that queer remark about someone dying. Thought it was just his way of stirring the pot." "And your opinion of Monsieur Gray?" Poirot asked, his tone deceptively mild. Sir Reginald shrugged. "Clever chap, but too full of himself. His plays are all the rage, but they're dark, too dark for my taste. Always poking at people's secrets. Made some enemies, I'd wager." Clara Carver followed, her nervous demeanor more pronounced in the intimacy of the antechamber. Her hands trembled as she spoke, and her eyes darted to the door as though expecting an interruption. "I was with Reginald, dancing," she said quickly. "I didn't see Lawrence after the library game. He frightened me with that talk of death." Poirot leaned forward, his voice gentle. "Madame, fear is a natural response to such words. But tell me, did you know Monsieur Gray well?" Clara shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Not well. He was distant. I met him only once before, at a London theatre. He seemed to know things about people, things they'd rather keep hidden." Dr. Malcolm Everett was next, his calm professionalism a stark contrast to Clara's unease. He sat with an air of detached curiosity, as though analyzing Poirot even as he was questioned. "I was on the terrace, smoking," he said. "I stepped out at about 1:45 and returned just before the scream. I saw no one enter or leave the library." "And your thoughts on Monsieur Gray?" Poirot asked. Everett's lips twitched in a faint smile. "A fascinating case study. His mind was sharp, but he was reckless, too eager to expose the flaws of others. That sort of thing invites trouble." Miss Eleanor Price entered with a defiant tilt of her chin, her novelist's eye taking in every detail of the room. "I was dancing with Julian Trent, as I said," she began without prompting. "I didn't follow Lawrence to the library, though I noticed he was agitated after the game. He kept looking at Violet Marlowe, as if he wanted to say something to her." Poirot's eyebrows rose. "And did you, mademoiselle, have any reason to wish Monsieur Gray harm?" Eleanor's eyes flashed. "If you're implying I had a motive, you're mistaken. Lawrence and I were colleagues, nothing more. His death is a shock, but I won't pretend I liked him. He was unkind." Julian Trent followed, his slick charm undiminished despite the circumstances. "I was with Eleanor, as she said. We danced, then stepped aside for a drink. I didn't see Gray after he left the ballroom. As for motives, I barely knew the man. Our paths crossed once or twice in London, but that's all." Violet Marlowe was the last to be interviewed, her delicate frame seeming to shrink under Poirot's scrutiny. "I was in the powder room," she said softly. "I needed a moment alone. Lawrence, he was watching me all evening. It made me uneasy." "Why, mademoiselle?" Poirot asked, his voice almost a whisper. Her eyes filled with tears, but she shook her head. "I don't know. He just knew things." As the interviews concluded, Poirot and Hastings returned to the drawing room, where the guests sat in tense silence. Poirot clasped his hands behind his back, his eyes sweeping over the assembly. "Mes amis, the truth begins to take shape, but there is much yet to uncover. I ask that you remain in the house and disturb nothing. Tomorrow we shall examine the library again, and the little grey cells. They shall work." Hastings, scribbling the final notes, felt a pang of unease. Each guest had an alibi, yet each seemed to hide something. Poirot's calm assurance was a beacon, but the shadows of Blackthorn Hall seemed to deepen, and Hastings knew the game was far from over. Chapter 4. The Threads of Inquiry.
The dawn broke over Blackthorn Hall with a pallor that matched the mood within its walls. The moors outside were shrouded in mist, lending the manor an air of isolation, as if it were an island adrift in a sea of secrets. The guests, confined to the house by Poirot's request and the severed telephone lines, moved through the morning with a restless unease, their polite facades fraying under the weight of Lawrence Gray's murder. Captain Arthur Hastings, who had managed only a fitful sleep in one of the guest rooms, found himself haunted by the image of Gray's lifeless body, the silver letter opener gleaming cruelly in the candlelight. Hercule Poirot, by contrast, appeared as composed as ever, his morning routine undisturbed by the grim events of the previous night. Hastings found him in the dining room, sipping a tisane and studying a small notebook in which he had jotted observations. The detective's suit was immaculate, his mustache perfectly groomed, and his eyes held a glint of quiet determination. "Poirot," Hastings said, settling across from him with a cup of strong coffee, "you seem remarkably unruffled. A man is dead, and we're stuck here with a murderer. Don't you feel the tension?" Poirot's lips, curved in had been locked since the discovery of the body. Lady Beatrice, pale but resolute, provided the key, and Poirot, Hastings, and Dr. Malcolm Everett, who had volunteered his medical expertise, entered the room. The scene was much as they had left it. Gray's body lay covered with a sheet, the letter opener still embedded in his chest, and the faint scent of brandy lingered in the air. The French doors to the terrace remained slightly ajar, and the candle on the side table had burned low, its wax pooling in a hardened cascade. Poirot moved with deliberate care, his eyes sweeping the room like a painter assessing a canvas. He paused at the desk, where the half-empty brandy glass still stood. "Hastings, observe," he said, lifting the glass to the light. "The residue. It is not quite as it should be. There is a faint cloudiness, a suggestion of something added to the liquor." "Poison?" Hastings asked, his voice low. "Perhaps," Poirot replied. "We shall have it analyzed when the police arrive. For now, we note its presence." He set the glass down and turned his attention to the letter opener. "The weapon? It is significant. It was taken from this very desk, yet it was not a casual choice. The garnets, the craftsmanship. Such a thing is not merely functional. It is a statement." Dr. Everett, who had been examining the body, looked up. "The wound confirms what I said last night. A single, forceful thrust to the heart. The killer knew exactly where to strike." Poirot nodded, his fingers tracing the edge of the desk. "And yet, the body was found here, on the rug, some distance from the desk. Did Monsieur Gray walk to this spot after being stabbed, or was he moved? We must consider the sequence." Hastings, ever practical, pointed to the French doors. "What about the terrace, Poirot? You said last night there might be footprints." "Oui, mon ami. Let us investigate." Poirot stepped outside, his patent leather shoes sinking slightly into the damp earth. The terrace was bordered by a low stone balustrade, beyond which the lawn sloped toward the moors. The ground was soft from the previous evening's rain, but Poirot's keen eyes detected no clear footprints leading to or from the doors. "As I suspected," he murmured. "The killer did not enter from outside. The answer lies within." Back in the library, Poirot's attention turned to the papers on the desk. Most were mundane, letters, a draft of a speech Lady Beatrice had prepared for the evening, but one item caught his eye, a single sheet of notepaper, folded and tucked beneath a blotter. He unfolded it carefully, revealing a handwritten note in a hurried scrawl. "You cannot shall compare it to a sample of his writing. But this note, it suggests a confrontation, a threat even. The morning progressed with Poirot conducting a second round of interviews, this time in greater depth, focusing on the relationships between the guests and Lawrence Gray. He began with Miss Eleanor Price, whose sharp wit seemed tempered by a wariness that had not been present the previous night. "Mademoiselle," Poirot said, settling into the antechamber with Hastings at his side, "you mentioned that Monsieur Gray was agitated last night, particularly toward Mademoiselle Marlowe. Can you elaborate?" Eleanor's eyes flicked to the door as though ensuring that they were alone. "Lawrence had a way of seeing through people. He'd been dropping hints all evening, especially during the game, about secrets he knew. I think he was trying to provoke someone, Violet in particular. She was so pale, so withdrawn, as if she feared him. And you, mademoiselle, did you fear him?" Poirot's question was gentle but pointed. Eleanor's jaw tightened. "I didn't fear him, but I didn't trust him. He reviewed one of my novels once, years ago, and called it a clever facade masking a hollow core. It stung, but I moved on. Others might not have been so forgiving. Next came Violet Marlowe, whose fragility seemed to deepen with each passing hour. She sat with her hands clasped tightly, her eyes avoiding Poirot's. "Mademoiselle," he said softly, "you told me last night that Monsieur Gray was watching you. Why do you think he did so?" Violet's voice was barely a whisper. I don't know. He always seemed to know more than he should, about my past, about things I've tried to forget." Poirot leaned forward, his tone almost paternal. "And what things are these, mademoiselle? Trust Hercule Poirot. The truth, it is your ally." Tears welled in her eyes, but she shook her head. "I can't, not yet." The interviews continued, each guest revealing a fragment of the connection to Gray. Sir Reginald admitted to a legal dispute with Gray over a theatre contract years ago, though he insisted it was resolved. Clara Carver confessed that Gray had once mocked her at a society event, leaving her humiliated. Julian Trent revealed a financial rivalry. Gray had invested in a competing firm, costing Trent a significant deal. Mrs. Dorothea Lang, with her penchant for the occult, claimed Gray had scoffed at her beliefs, calling her a charlatan in public. Dr. Everett was the most forthcoming, admitting to a professional disagreement with Gray. "He consulted me once, about a year ago," Everett said, his voice measured. "He was researching a play about madness and betrayal. We argued over the ethics of exposing private pain for art. I found him ruthless." As the interviews concluded, Poirot and Hastings retired to the conservatory, where the scent of damp earth and hothouse flowers mingled.
Incongruously, Poirot paced slowly, his hands clasped behind his back.
"Hastings, we have a tapestry of motives, resentment, humiliation, financial loss, fear. But the note, the brandy, the letter opener, these are the threads we must weave together." "Do you think the note was from Gray?" Hastings asked. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "It is possible, but I suspect it is a clever misdirection. The killer wishes us to believe Gray was the aggressor, but perhaps it is the reverse. We must look closer at Mademoiselle Marlowe. Her fear, it is not merely grief, it is guilt, or perhaps a secret she cannot bear to reveal." The morning wore on, and the guests remained under Poirot's watchful eye, their alibis holding but their stories fraying at the edges. Blackthorn Hall, once a haven of elegance, was now a labyrinth of suspicion, and Hastings knew that Poirot was only beginning to navigate its twists. Chapter 5. The Red Herrings. The morning light filtering through the leaded windows of Blackthorn Hall did little to dispel the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over the manor. The guests, confined by the storm-damaged telephone lines and Poirot's quiet but firm insistence, moved through the house like actors in a play they no longer understood. Captain Arthur Hastings, ever the observer, noted the strained politeness that masked their growing unease. Breakfast had been a somber affair, with conversation limited to murmurs about the weather and pointed silences whenever Lawrence Gray's name arose.
Hercule Poirot, however, was in his element, his sharp eyes and meticulous demeanour cutting through the fog of suspicion like a beacon. Poirot had requested that the guests gather in the drawing-room after breakfast, a directive that was met with reluctant compliance. As they assembled, Hastings watched Poirot pace before the fireplace, his small hands clasped behind his back, his head tilted as if listening to an inner dialogue. The detective's presence was a paradox, unassuming yet commanding, a figure whose very calmness seemed to unnerve the room. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, his voice clear and measured. "We find ourselves in a delicate situation. A man is dead, and among us is the one responsible. But the path to the truth is obscured by what the English call red herrings, distractions that lead the unwary astray. Hercule Poirot, however, is not so easily misled. Let us examine the facts and see where they point." The guests exchanged wary glances, and Hastings noted the way Julian Trent's hand tightened on his cigarette case, the nervous flutter of Clara Carver's eyelids, and the rigid posture of Violet Marlowe, who sat as though braced for a blow. Lady Beatrice, ever the hostess, attempted a smile, but it faltered under Poirot's scrutiny. Poirot continued, "The police, when they arrive, will no doubt focus on the most obvious suspect." "And Trent?" A gasp rippled through the room, and Trent's head snapped up, his charming facade cracking. "Me? That's preposterous. I barely knew Gray." Poirot raised a hand, silencing him. "Monsieur, you admitted to a financial rivalry with the deceased. Your firm lost a significant deal because of his investments, and last night, during the game of secrets, you spoke of debts unpaid. A curious phrase, n'est-ce pas? The police might wonder if you sought to settle such a debt with the letter opener." Trent's face flushed, but his voice was steady. "I was in the ballroom, dancing with Eleanor. She'll vouch for me. And yes, Gray cost me money, but I don't stab a man over a business deal. That's absurd." Eleanor Price nodded quickly. "He was with me, Monsieur Poirot. We danced until the scream." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "And yet, mademoiselle, you yourself had reason to dislike Monsieur Gray. His review of your novel was scathing, was it not? A public humiliation for a writer of your ambition." Eleanor's lips tightened, but she met his gaze defiantly. "I told you, I moved on. I don't kill over bad reviews." Poirot turned to the room at large, his voice taking on a conversational tone that belied its steel. "You see, mes amis, the obvious is often the least true. The police might seize upon Monsieur Trent's motive or Mademoiselle Price's resentment, but Hercule Poirot looks deeper. Let us consider the timeline once more. The scream was heard at 12 minutes past midnight. Monsieur Gray was last seen alive at 20 minutes to midnight, entering the library. In those 20 minutes, someone entered, stabbed him, and left, unless, of course, they were already in the room." The suggestion hung in the air, and Hastings saw Clara Carver's hand fly to her throat. Sir Reginald, seated beside her, cleared his throat loudly. "Now see here, Poirot, you can't go accusing everyone. My wife and I were dancing the whole time. We've nothing to hide." Poirot's smile was enigmatic. "And yet, Sir Reginald, you had a legal dispute with Monsieur Gray, did you not? A matter of a theatre contract that left you bitter?" Sir Reginald's face reddened. "That was years ago. Water under the bridge. I'm not the sort to hold a grudge." Clara's voice was barely audible. "He's right. We were together, dancing. We didn't see Lawrence after dinner." Poirot's gaze shifted to Violet Marlowe, whose pale face seemed to grow even whiter. "Mademoiselle Marlowe, you were in the powder room alone during the critical time. A convenient alibi
but one that cannot be verified, was casting a net, testing reactions, sowing doubt. The detective turned to Dr. Malcolm Everett, who sat with an air of detached amusement. "Doctor, you were on the terrace smoking. A solitary pursuit, and one that places you near the library's French doors. Did you see anything unusual?" Everett's eyes narrowed slightly. "As I said, I saw no one enter or leave. The terrace was quiet, save for the wind. I returned to the ballroom just before the scream." "And Madame Lang," Poirot continued, addressing the eccentric widow. "You were in the conservatory, consulting your tarot cards. A most singular occupation for such a night." Mrs. Dorothea Lang's rings clinked as she gestured animatedly. "The cards warned of danger, Monsieur Poirot. I drew the Tower and the Death card. I knew something terrible was coming, but I didn't know it would be Lawrence." Poirot's expression remained impassive. "The cards, they are interesting, but Hercule Poirot relies on the evidence of the senses. Let us return to the library. The letter opener, the brandy glass, the note, these are the clues that speak, and they tell me that our killer is clever, but not infallible." He paused, letting the silence stretch, then addressed Lady Beatrice. "Madame, you have been most cooperative, yet you too had a connection to Monsieur Gray. An old friendship, you said, but one recently renewed. Tell me, was there more to this relationship?" Lady Beatrice's eyes flashed with indignation. "I resent the implication, Monsieur Poirot. Lawrence was a guest, nothing more. I invited him because of his literary reputation. I was in the ballroom, as I told you, and the servants can confirm it." Poirot inclined his head. "Of course, madame. But the truth, it is like a mosaic. Each piece must fit perfectly. We shall see." As the guests dispersed, instructed to remain within the house, Poirot drew Hastings aside. "Mon ami, you see how they deflect, how they weave their stories. The red herrings are plentiful, but they serve only to obscure the truth. Trent's rivalry, Price's humiliation, Marlowe's fear. These are distractions, but not without purpose. The killer wishes us to look at the obvious, but we must look beyond." Hastings frowned. "But Poirot, their alibis seem solid. Trent and Price were together, the Carvers were dancing, Everett was on the terrace, Marlowe in the powder room, Lang with her cards, and Lady Beatrice in the ballroom. Who could have done it?" Poirot's eyes twinkled. "The alibis, Hastings. They are like a house of cards, impressive until one examines the foundation. Consider the timing. 20 minutes is not long, but it is enough. And the library, it is not so isolated as it seems. The French doors, the connected
Roads cleared, Hastings felt a growing sense of unease. Poirot's questions had stirred the waters, but the ripples were only beginning to spread. The red herrings were indeed plentiful, but Hastings knew that Poirot's little grey cells were already sifting through them, seeking the one truth that would unravel the mystery of Blackthorn Hall. Chapter 6. A Clue in Detail. The mist that clung to the moors around Blackthorn Hall seemed to seep into the very walls of the manor, lending an air of oppressive stillness to the morning. The guests, confined by the severed telephone lines and Poirot's watchful presence, moved through the house like ghosts, their voices hushed and their glances laden with suspicion. Captain Arthur Hastings, nursing a second cup of coffee in the dining room, felt the weight of the previous night's events pressing upon him. The image of Lawrence Gray's lifeless body, the silver letter opener glinting cruelly in the candlelight, haunted his thoughts. Yet Hercule Poirot, seated across from him, was as composed as ever, his small hands folded neatly over a notebook, his eyes bright with the fire of deduction.
Poirot," Hastings ventured, "you've stirred things up with your questions, but we're no closer to the truth. Everyone has an alibi, and yet someone in this house is a murderer. How do you propose to find them?" Poirot's lips curved in a faint, enigmatic smile. "Mon ami, the truth is like a diamond, hidden in plain sight, but revealed only when one knows where to look. Last night we cast light upon the red herrings. Today we find the detail that does not fit, the clue that betrays the killer's hand." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lady Beatrice, who entered the dining room with a tray of fresh tea. Her movements precise, but her face pale. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings," she said, her voice steady despite the strain in her eyes. "The servants are preparing luncheon, and I've asked them to assist with anything you require. The police should arrive by afternoon, once the roads are clear." "Merci, madame," Poirot replied, his tone courteous but probing. "Your hospitality remains impeccable, even in such trying circumstances. Tell me, have you noticed anything amiss this morning? Any behavior among the guests that strikes you as unusual?" Lady Beatrice hesitated, her fingers lingering on the teapot. "They are all on edge, naturally. Violet Marlowe has scarcely left her room, and Mr. Trent seems unusually agitated. But that's to be expected, isn't it?" Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. "Perhaps, but it is the unexpected that interests Hercule Poirot." After precision of a watchmaker, his attention drawn first to the desk with a mysterious note, "You cannot hide forever, the truth will out," still lay beneath the blotter. "Hastings," Poirot said, holding the note to the light, "this paper, it is of fine quality, but the ink is smudged, as if written in haste. Yet the signature, L.G., is deliberate. We must compare it to Gray's handwriting, but I suspect it is a forgery, a clever touch to make us believe Gray was the aggressor." Hastings frowned. "But who would forge such a note? And why?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "To shift suspicion, mon ami, to make us think Gray provoked his own death. But let us look closer." He moved to the French doors, examining the latch and the frame. The lock was intact, with no signs of tampering, but Poirot's attention was drawn to a small detail, a single thread, barely visible, caught in the hinge of the door. It was a deep green, almost imperceptible against the dark wood, but Poirot plucked it carefully with a pair of tweezers and held it up to the light. "Curieux," he murmured, "a thread of green silk, not from the curtains, which are velvet, nor from the rug, which is wool. This comes from a garment, perhaps a gown or a scarf." Hastings' mind raced. "Lady Beatrice wore an emerald gown last night. Could it be hers?" Poirot's smile was enigmatic. "Possible, but we must not leap to conclusions. Many fabrics are green, and our killer is cunning. Let us consider another detail." He turned to the brandy glass, which he had noted the previous night for its faint cloudiness. Carefully, he dipped a clean handkerchief into the residue and sniffed it, his nose wrinkling slightly. The scent of almonds, very faint. Cyanide, perhaps, or something similar. The glass must be preserved for analysis, but this suggests an attempt to ensure Gray's death should the letter opener fail. Hastings' eyes widened. "You mean the killer poisoned him first, then stabbed him? That's diabolical." "Précisément," Poirot said. "The killer is thorough, but not without flaw. The poison, it was not necessary if the stab was fatal, as Dr. Everett claims. This suggests either panic or a desire to confuse. We must look for the contradiction. Their inspection was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. It was Miss Eleanor Price, her sharp features drawn with fatigue, but her eyes alert. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, "I couldn't help overhearing your conversation in the dining room. I thought you should know something about Violet Marlowe." Poirot gestured for her to enter, his expression one of polite curiosity. "Speak, mademoiselle. What is it you wish to—" Her slip out of the ballroom just before he did, though she claimed to be in the powder room.
Poirot's eyebrows rose.
"A significant observation, mademoiselle. And why do you share this now?"
Eleanor's jaw tightened. "Because I don't trust her. She's too quiet, too fragile. It's an act, I'm sure of it. Lawrence was cruel, but he wasn't wrong about people's secrets."
Poirot nodded, dismissing her with a courteous nod. As she left, he turned to Hastings.
"You see, mon ami, the threads begin to weave together. Mademoiselle Marlowe's fear, it is not merely grief, it is knowledge. But is she the killer or a pawn in another's game?"
Their next stop was Violet Marlowe's room, where Poirot knocked gently. The young woman opened the door, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed. She wore a simple grey dress, a stark contrast to the elegance of the previous night, and her hands trembled as she invited them in.
"Mademoiselle,"
Poirot began, his voice soft but firm,
"you have told me that Monsieur Grey's attention made you uneasy. I must ask again, what did he know about you?"
Violet's eyes filled with tears, but she shook her head.
"I can't tell you, it's too painful. But I didn't kill him, I swear it."
Poirot's gaze softened, but his voice was relentless.
"Mademoiselle, the truth is your only refuge. If you conceal it, you risk becoming the prime suspect. Speak, and let Hercule Poirot judge."
She hesitated, then whispered,
"He knew about my father. He was disgraced years ago in a scandal. Lawrence threatened to expose it, to ruin me and Julian. But I didn't kill him. I was in the powder room, as I said."
Poirot studied her for a long moment, then nodded.
"Merci, mademoiselle. We shall speak again."
As they left her room, Hastings turned to Poirot. "Do you believe her, Poirot? She's hiding something, but murder?" Poirot's eyes were distant, his mind already turning over the new clues.
"The green thread, the poisoned brandy, the forged note, these are the details that speak, Hastings. And they tell me that our killer is not only cunning, but desperate. Mademoiselle Marlowe's secret is a piece of the puzzle, but it is not the whole. We must look to the contradictions, the alibis that are too perfect, the motives that are too obvious."
The morning wore on, and the police had yet to arrive, delayed by the muddy roads. Blackthorn Hall remained a crucible of secrets, and Hastings knew that Poirot was closing in on the truth, one meticulous detail at a time. The green thread in particular lingered.
Unyielding scrutiny had grown increasingly fractious, their polite masks slipping to reveal raw nerves and hidden resentments. Captain Arthur Hastings, standing by the drawing-room window, watched the moors with a sense of unease, the isolation of the manor amplifying the tension within. Hercule Poirot, however, remained a beacon of calm, his meticulous nature undeterred by the rising tide of suspicion. His notebook, now filled with cryptic jottings, lay open on a side table, and his eyes gleamed with the quiet intensity of a man closing in on his prey. "Poirot," Hastings said, turning from the window, "this place feels like a powder keg. Everyone's on edge, and I can't shake the feeling that someone's about to crack. Do you think we're getting closer?" Poirot's lips twitched in a faint smile. Mon ami, it is precisely when the nerves are strained that the truth begins to surface. Lies, they are like weeds. They flourish in the dark but wither under the light of scrutiny. Today, we shall apply that light. Their morning's discoveries, the green silk thread, the clouded brandy glass, the smudged note signed LG, had given Poirot a framework, but he needed more. He'd arranged for the guests to gather once again in the drawing room, ostensibly to discuss the impending arrival of the police. But Hastings knew his friend's true purpose: to probe deeper, to unearth the secrets that lay beneath the alibis. As the guests assembled, their faces a study in contrasts, Lady Beatrice's strained composure, Julian Trent's forced nonchalance, Violet Marlowe's fragile silence, Poirot stood before the fireplace, his small figure commanding attention. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his voice smooth but edged with steel. "We have established the facts of Monsieur Gray's death, but facts alone are not enough. There are motives hidden in the shadows that we must now bring to light. Each of you has a connection to the deceased, and each of you has something you conceal." A murmur of protest rippled through the room, but Poirot raised a hand. "No, do not deny it. The little grey cells, they see what the eyes do not. Let us begin with a simple question. What did Monsieur Gray know about you that made you fear him?" The question hung in the air, and the silence that followed was heavy with unspoken truths. It was Mrs. Dorothea Lang who broke it, her voice quivering with indignation. "Monsieur Poirot, I resent the implication. Lawrence mocked my beliefs, yes, but I had no reason to fear him. My life is an open book. My cards tell all." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And yet, madame, you were in the conservatory alone at the time of the murder. Your cards, they did not warn you."
Carver, whose ruddy face was flushed with irritation. "So, Reginald, you mentioned a legal dispute with Monsieur Gray. You called it water under the bridge, but such matters often leave a residue of bitterness. Did he threaten you recently, perhaps with new accusations?" Sir Reginald's laugh was forced. "Nonsense, Poirot. That business was settled years ago. Gray was a troublemaker, but I had no cause to kill him. Clara and I were dancing, as we said." Clara Carver, seated beside her husband, nodded quickly, but her hands twisted her handkerchief into knots. Poirot's gaze softened as he addressed her. "Madame, you spoke of a humiliation at Monsieur Gray's hands. Was it merely a social slight, or something deeper?" Clara's eyes darted to her husband, then back to Poirot. "It was personal," she whispered. "At a dinner in London, years ago, he implied I was unfaithful. It wasn't true, but it hurt Reginald's reputation. We never spoke of it again." The admission sent a ripple through the room, and Sir Reginald's face darkened. "That's enough, Clara," he snapped. "It's ancient history." Poirot's eyebrows rose, but he moved on to Julian Trent, whose slick charm seemed to falter under scrutiny. "Monsieur Trent, your financial rivalry with Monsieur Gray was significant. Did he perhaps know something about your business dealings, something you would prefer to keep hidden?" Trent's smile was tight. "Gray was a nuisance, I'll admit. He backed a rival firm, cost me a fortune. But I don't kill over money, Poirot. I was with Eleanor, as she confirmed." Eleanor Price, seated nearby, nodded, but her expression was guarded. Poirot turned to her. "Mademoiselle, your resentment toward Monsieur Gray was not merely professional. His review of your work was cruel, but was there more? A personal slight, perhaps?" Eleanor's jaw tightened. "He was spiteful, yes, but I told you, I've moved past it. I was dancing with Julian when it happened. You're barking up the wrong tree." Poirot's gaze shifted to Violet Marlowe, who sat like a porcelain figurine, her hands clasped tightly.
Mademoiselle Marlowe, you have admitted that Monsieur Gray knew of your father's scandal, but was there more to his threats? Did he seek to use this knowledge against you, or against Monsieur Trent?
Violet's eyes filled with tears, and her voice was barely audible.
He hinted that he knew about Julian's business, something about investments that weren't proper. He said he'd tell everyone unless I convinced Julian to back out of a deal. I didn't know what to do.
The room went still, and Trent's face paled. "Violet, you never told me this," he said, his voice low with anger. Poirot's eyes gleamed.
And so, we uncover another thread. Monsieur Trent.
I'd have confronted him myself. But I didn't kill him, Poirot. I was with Eleanor.
The final guest, Dr. Malcolm Everett, leaned back in his chair, his expression one of detached curiosity. "Doctor," Poirot said, "you argued with Monsieur Gray over the ethics of his plays. Did he perhaps know something about your own professional conduct?" Everett's smile was thin. "Gray was a provocateur. He tried to pry into my work, my patience, but I gave him nothing. I was on the terrace, as I said. I saw nothing, heard nothing." Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. "Merci, all of you. The lies they begin to surface, but the truth remains elusive. We shall continue to probe." As the guests dispersed, their faces a mix of relief and apprehension, Poirot drew Hastings aside. "You see, mon ami, the motives multiply. Clara's humiliation, Trent's financial loss, Violet's secret, Everett's professional pride. Each is a thread, but none is the whole tapestry. The green silk, the poisoned brandy, the forged note, these are the clues that will lead us to the killer." Hastings frowned. "But Poirot, Violet's revelation about Trent's business dealings, that's significant. Could Trent have killed Gray to protect his reputation?" Poirot's eyes twinkled. "Possible, but too obvious. The killer wishes us to look at Trent, at Marlowe, at the carvers. But the truth lies in the details. The green thread caught in the hinge suggests a presence at the French doors. And the poison, it was unnecessary if the stab was fatal. This suggests a killer who is both calculating and uncertain." As they prepared to revisit the library, a servant approached, his face pale. "Monsieur Poirot, sir, we found something in the conservatory. A scarf, green silk, tucked behind a potted fern." Poirot's eyes lit up. "Show me, if you please." The scarf, delicate and shimmering, matched the thread from the library door. It bore no monogram, but its presence was a revelation. "Hastings," Poirot said, "the net tightens. This scarf, it belongs to someone in this house, and that someone was in the library, or near it, when Monsieur Gray met his end." The afternoon loomed, and with it the promise of the police's arrival. But Hastings knew that Poirot would not wait for them. The lies were surfacing, and the little grey cells were weaving them into a pattern only he could see. Chapter 8. The Emotional Turning Point. The discovery of the green silk scarf in the conservatory sent a ripple of unease through Blackthorn Hall, as though the manor itself were holding its breath. The guests, already strained by the weight of suspicion and confinement, seemed to fray further as the afternoon wore on. Captain Arthur Hastings, standing in the conservatory with its heavy scent of damp earth and exotic blooms, felt the tension like a physical force. The scarf,
Tangible link to the crime that had shattered the Halloween masquerade. Poirot's eyes, sharp and unyielding, studied the fabric as though it held the key to the entire mystery. "Mon ami," Poirot said, his voice low, "this scarf, it is no mere accessory. It is a witness to the truth, caught in the hinge of the library door, hidden here to evade discovery. But the killer, they are not as clever as they believe." Hastings frowned, his mind racing. "It could belong to anyone, Poirot. Lady Beatrice wore an emerald gown, and Mrs. Lang is fond of dramatic accessories. Even Violet Marlowe might have worn something green beneath her cloak. Poirot's lips curved in a faint smile. Precisement, Hastings, but we shall narrow the field. The scarf, it is silk, finely made, and it matches the thread from the library. We must ask ourselves, who had reason to be near those French doors, and who sought to conceal this evidence? Their conversation was interrupted by a stifled sob from the doorway. Violet Marlowe stood there, her delicate frame trembling, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and despair. "Monsieur Poirot," she whispered, I must speak with you. Alone." Poirot's expression softened, but his gaze remained piercing. "Mademoiselle, you have my attention. Hastings, if you please, remain here and ensure no one disturbs us." Hastings nodded, stepping back as Poirot led Violet to a secluded corner of the conservatory, where a wrought iron bench sat beneath a cascade of ferns. Violet sank onto the bench, her hands twisting in her lap, her face pale as moonlight. Poirot sat opposite her, his posture attentive but unyielding. "Speak, mademoiselle," he said gently. "The truth, it is a burden, but it is also a release." Violet's voice was barely audible, choked with emotion. "It's about Lawrence and me. He knew something terrible about my past. Not just my father's scandal, but something I did. Years ago, when I was young and desperate. I stole money from a theatre company where Lawrence worked. It was a small amount, but it ruined the production. He found out, somehow, and he's been holding it over me ever since." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And he threatened to expose this unless you persuaded Monsieur Trent to abandon his business deal?" She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Yes, I didn't know what to do. Julian's business is everything to him, and if Lawrence had told the truth, it would have ruined us both. I was in the library last night, before the scream. I went to beg him to stay silent, but he laughed at me. He said the truth would come out no matter what I did." Poirot leaned forward, his voice soft but insistent. "And what happened then, mademoiselle? Did you strike him?" Violet's eyes widened in horror.
Scarf. It was green silk, a gift from Julian. I didn't realize it was missing until later. Poirot's expression was unreadable, but his fingers drummed lightly on the arm of the bench. "You did not mention this visit to the library before? Why?" "I was afraid," she whispered. "Afraid you'd think I killed him. But I didn't, Monsieur Poirot. I couldn't." Poirot studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Merci, mademoiselle. Your candor is noted. Return to your room and say nothing of this to the others." As Violet left, her steps unsteady, Hastings rejoined Poirot, his brow furrowed. "Good Lord, Poirot, that's a bombshell! If she was in the library, she could have killed him. And the scarf! It's hers!" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Perhaps, Hastings. But the truth, it is not so simple. Mademoiselle Marlowe's confession is a turning point, but it raises questions. If she left Gray alive, who entered the library next? And why hide the scarf in the conservatory? We must test her story." Their next move was to question the servants, who had been quietly observing the guests from the margins. The butler, a stoic man named Harris, confirmed that Lady Beatrice had been in the ballroom overseeing refreshments until just before the scream. But he admitted to noticing Violet Marlowe hurrying through the hall towards the powder room at around 10 minutes to midnight. A maid, Jenny, added that she had seen Mrs. Lang in the conservatory earlier that evening, arranging her tarot cards, but had not seen her after 11:30. Poirot's inquiries then turned to the green scarf itself. He summoned the guests to the drawing room once more, holding the scarf aloft like a trophy. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said, his voice commanding silence. "This scarf was found in the conservatory, hidden behind a fern.
A thread matching it was caught in the hinge of the library's French doors. To whom does it belong? A hush fell over the room, broken only by Violet Marlowe's sharp intake of breath. It's mine," she said, her voice trembling. "I told you, Monsieur Poirot, I lost it last night." Julian Trent's face darkened. "Violet, you didn't say you were in the library. What's this about?" Before she could respond, Mrs. Lang spoke up, her voice sharp. "That scarf could belong to anyone. Green silk is hardly unique. I myself have a shawl of similar color." Lady Beatrice's eyes narrowed. "Dorothea, you were in the conservatory last night. Did you hide it there to cast suspicion on Violet?" Mrs. Lang's rings clinked as she gestured indignantly. "How dare you? I was reading the cards, not hiding evidence." The room erupted into accusations, with Sir Reginald demanding order, Clara Carver shrinking into her
Story. We must consider its placement. Why hide it in the conservatory, where it might be found, unless to divert attention? He turned to Violet. "Mademoiselle, you say you lost the scarf in the library, yet it was found elsewhere. Did you see anyone else there when you spoke with Monsieur Gray?" Violet shook her head, her eyes wide.
"No, it was just us. He was sitting at the desk, drinking brandy. I left him there, I swear."
Poirot's gaze shifted to the others, his voice taking on a probing edge. "And who among you passed through the hall, or the conservatory, between 11:30 and midnight? Speak now, for the truth will not remain hidden." The guests hesitated, their alibis reiterated with less conviction. Trent admitted to stepping into the hall for a cigarette. Everett repeated his claim of being on the terrace, and Clara Carver said she had visited the powder room briefly before returning to dance with her husband. Each statement was met with Poirot's unyielding scrutiny, and Hastings could almost see the wheels turning in his friend's mind. As the guests dispersed, Poirot drew Hastings aside. "Mon ami, Mademoiselle Marlowe's confession is a crack in the facade, but it is not the whole truth. The scarf, the poison, the note, they point to a killer who is both bold and desperate. We must look to the contradictions, the timing, the placement, the motives that run deeper than we yet know." The afternoon stretched on, the police still delayed by the muddy roads. Blackthorn Hall was a crucible of emotion, and Violet's revelation had set it ablaze. Hastings knew that Poirot was closing in, but the truth remained just out of reach, hidden in the shadows of lies and half-truths. Chapter 9. The Trap. The afternoon light filtered weakly through the heavy drapes of Blackthorn Hall, casting long shadows that seemed to mirror the growing unease among its inhabitants. The discovery of Violet Marlowe's green silk scarf, coupled with her tearful confession, had set the guests on edge, their strained civility giving way to open suspicion. Captain Arthur Hastings, standing by the drawing-room's grand fireplace, felt the tension like a tightening noose. The manor, once a bastion of elegance, now felt like a gilded cage, and the arrival of the police, delayed by the sodden roads, only heightened the sense of entrapment. Hercule Poirot, however, was in his element, his small figure radiating a quiet authority as he prepared to tighten the net around the killer. His notebook, filled with meticulous jottings, lay closed on a side table, but Hastings knew that Poirot's mind was a whirl of connections. Each clue, the green thread, the poisoned brandy, the forged note, Violet's confession, fitting into a pattern only he could see. The detective's eyes gleamed with anticipation as he addressed the assembled guests, who sat in a tense semicircle, their faces a mixture of apprehension and defiance. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, his voice smooth but laced with an undercurrent of steel, "we stand at a crossroads in this affair. A man is dead, murdered in this very house, and the truth lies among us, concealed by lies and half-truths.
But Hercule Poirot does not deal in shadows. Today, we shall lay a trap for the truth, and the killer will reveal themselves, whether they intend to or not. A murmur of unease rippled through the room. Lady Beatrice, her emerald gown replaced by a sombre navy dress, gripped the arm of her chair. Monsieur Poirot, what do you mean by a trap? Surely you don't suspect us all. Poirot's smile was enigmatic. Madame, in a house where secrets are currency, all are suspect until proven otherwise. But fear not, the trap is not for the innocent. Let us review the facts, and then we shall see who falters. He paced slowly before the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back. Monsieur Laurence Gray was stabbed in the library at approximately midnight, with a letter opener from the desk. A glass of brandy, possibly poisoned, was found nearby, and a note, signed L.G., suggested a confrontation. A green silk thread, matching a scarf belonging to Mademoiselle Marlowe, was caught in the hinge of the library's French doors, and the scarf itself was hidden in the conservatory. These are the threads of our tapestry, but they do not yet form the whole picture. Julian Trent, his face tight with irritation, leaned forward. You're circling around Violet again, Poirot. She admitted to being in the library, but she didn't kill him. I was with Eleanor, as I've said a dozen times.
You're wasting time, Monsieur Poirot. Poirot's gaze swept over them, unperturbed.
Patience, mes amis. The truth is not found in haste. Let us consider the alibis once more, but with a new perspective. Mademoiselle Marlowe, you were in the library pleading with Monsieur Gray. You say you left him alive, yet your scarf was found in the conservatory. How did it come to be there? Violet's voice trembled, her hands twisting in her lap. I don't know. I told you I lost it that night. Someone must have taken it. Poirot turned to Mrs. Dorothea Lang, whose garish rings glinted as she gestured nervously. Madame Lang, you were in the conservatory, reading your tarot cards. Did you see the scarf, or perhaps place it there to divert suspicion? Mrs. Lang's eyes widened. I did no such thing. I was meditating, as I said. The cards warned of danger, but I saw nothing of a scarf. Sir Reginald Carver's voice boomed. This is absurd, Poirot. You're accusing everyone without evidence. Clara and I were dancing, and that's that. Clara nodded, her face pale. Yes, we were together. I didn't go near the library. Poirot's eyes softened as he addressed Dr. Malcolm Everett. Doctor, you were on the terrace near the French doors, a convenient position perhaps to observe or to act. Everett's smile was thin. I told you, I saw nothing. I was smoking, enjoying the night air. You're grasping at straws, Poirot. Poirot's voice took on a new intensity. Non, doctor. I grasp at truths, and now we set the trap. I propose a reconstruction of the night's events. Each of you will take your place as you were at 20 minutes to midnight, and we shall see what emerges. We shall begin in the ballroom, then move to the library. Objections? The guests exchanged uneasy glances, but none dared refuse. Poirot led them to the ballroom, where the gramophone stood silent, its needle poised as if waiting for the music to resume. The chandeliers cast a dim glow, and the air was heavy with the memory of the masquerade. Picture the scene, Poirot said, his voice almost theatrical. It is 20 minutes to midnight. Monsieur Gray leaves the ballroom, saying he seeks a book in the library. Mademoiselle Marlowe, you follow shortly after, to plead with him. Monsieur Trent and Mademoiselle Price, you are dancing. Sir Reginald and Madame Carver, you too are dancing. Dr. Everett, you step onto the terrace. Madame Lang, you are in the conservatory. And you, Madame Ashburn, are overseeing the refreshments. Correct? The guests nodded, their movements stiff as they took their positions. Poirot led them through the sequence, noting their placements with meticulous care. As they reached the library, he paused at the French doors, where the visit to the library. timing her movements from the ballroom to the desk where Gray had sat. She moved hesitantly, the steps echoing in the silent room. "I spoke to him here," she said, pointing to the desk. "Then I left, through the main door." Poirot nodded, then turned to Everett. "Doctor, show me your position on the terrace." Everett complied, stepping outside and standing near the balustrade, his cigarette case in hand. Poirot watched closely, then moved to the conservatory, where Mrs. Lang stood by her tarot cards. "Now," Poirot said, his voice sharp, "let us consider the scarf. Mademoiselle Marlowe, you say you lost it in the library, yet it was found here in the conservatory. Madame Lang, you were here. Did you see anyone pass through?" Mrs. Lang shook her head, but her voice faltered. "No, I was focused on the cards." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "And yet, someone placed the scarf here. Someone who knew it would implicate Mademoiselle Marlowe. Let us return to the library." As they gathered around the desk, Poirot's tone grew grave. "The killer is among us, and they are watching. The poison in the brandy, the forged note, the scarf, these are not accidents. They are a design meant to mislead. But Hercule Poirot sees through the design. I ask you now, who among you moved the scarf?" The question hung in the air, and the silence was deafening. Then, to everyone's shock, Clara Carver let out a choked sob, her hands flying to her face. "I can't bear it anymore," she cried. "I saw the scarf in the library. After Violet left, I picked it up and hid it in the conservatory. I didn't want her to be blamed." The room erupted in gasps, and Sir Reginald's face reddened. "Clara, what are you saying?" She turned to him, tears streaming down her face. "I thought it was yours, Reginald. I thought you'd been in the library, that you'd done something. I was protecting you." Poirot's eyes were like twin flames. "Madame Carver, you have taken a great risk. Did you see Monsieur Gray alive when you found the scarf?" Clara shook her head, her voice breaking. "No, he was already dead. I swear it." The trap had sprung, and the room was ablaze with emotion. Hastings knew that Poirot had orchestrated this moment, but the truth was still elusive, hidden in the web of lies and revelations. Chapter 10. The Reveal. The drawing room of Blackthorn Hall was suffused with a tense stillness, the late afternoon light casting long shadows that seemed to dance with the secrets of the night before. The guests, gathered at Hercule Poirot's command, sat in a semicircle, their faces a mosaic of fear,
Methods, meticulous, psychological, relentless, and he sensed that the moment of revelation was at hand. Poirot stood before the hearth, his small figure radiating an almost theatrical authority. His eyes, sharp as cut glass, swept over the assembly, lingering on each guest as if peering into their very souls. The green silk scarf, now resting on a side table, seemed to glow with significance, a silent witness to the crime that had shattered the masquerade. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, his voice clear and resonant, "we have reached the climax of this tragic affair. A man, Lawrence Gray, lies dead, murdered in the library of this fine house. The clues, the poisoned brandy, the forged note, the green silk scarf, have led us through a labyrinth of lies. But Hercule Poirot does not falter in the face of deception. The little grey cells, they have worked, and now they shall reveal the truth." A murmur rippled through the room, but Poirot raised a hand for silence. "Let us reconstruct the crime, step by step, and see where the threads converge. At 20 minutes to midnight, Monsieur Gray left the ballroom, saying he sought a book in the library.
Mademoiselle Marlowe followed, pleading with him to keep her secret, a theft from years past. She left him alive, she says, and lost her green silk scarf. Madame Carver, in a moment of panic, found the scarf and hid it in the conservatory, believing it belonged to her husband. But these are not the whole story. Let us examine the clues with precision. He paced slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. The brandy glass. It contained a trace of poison, cyanide, perhaps, though not enough to kill alone. The letter opener, driven with force into Monsieur Grey's heart, was the true cause of death. The note, signed LG, suggested a threat, but its ink was smudged, its handwriting not quite Grey's. And the green thread, caught in the hinge of the French doors, matched Mademoiselle Marlowe's scarf. These clues, they point to a killer who is both cunning and desperate. Violet Marlowe let out a soft sob, and Julian Trent's hand tightened on hers. "You can't still suspect Violet," he said, his voice tight. "She told you everything." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Non, Monsieur Trent, not everything, but let us proceed. The alibis, they are too perfect, too rehearsed. Monsieur Trent and Mademoiselle Price dancing together. Sir Reginald and Madame Carver also dancing. Dr. Everett on the terrace, Madame Lang in the conservatory, Madame Ashbourne overseeing the refreshments, and Mademoiselle Marlowe in the powder room after her visit to the library. Yet one of these
Claimed to be dancing with your husband? Clara's hands trembled.
I stepped away for a moment. I needed air. I went to the library, saw the scarf and panicked. I thought it was Reginald's doing."
Poirot's voice was gentle, but unyielding. "And yet, madame, your husband's alibi depends on you. If you were not dancing, where was he?" Sir Reginald's face reddened.
Now see here, Poirot. I was in the ballroom, as I said. Clara was with me most of the time.
"Most of the time," Poirot repeated, his tone sharp. "But not all. Let us turn to another detail, the note. It was meant to suggest that Monsieur Grey was the aggressor, threatening someone with exposure, but the handwriting, it is not his. I have compared it to a sample from his papers. The note was written by another hand, one skilled in deception." He paused, letting the silence stretch, then turned to Dr. Malcolm Everett. "Doctor, you are a man of science, trained to observe the human mind. You argued with Monsieur Grey over the ethics of his plays. But was there more? Did he know something about your practice, perhaps a patient whose secrets you could not afford to have exposed?" Everett's smile was thin, almost mocking. "You're reaching, Poirot. Grey was a nuisance, but I had no reason to kill him. I was on the terrace, as I said." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And yet, doctor, you were near the French doors where the green thread was found. A thread from a scarf you could have picked up, knowing it would implicate Mademoiselle Marlowe." The room gasped, and Violet's eyes widened. "No, it was my scarf. I lost it in the library." Poirot turned to her, his expression softening. "Oui, mademoiselle, it was yours, but it was moved by another. And now we come to the heart of the matter." He stepped forward, his voice rising with dramatic intensity. "The killer is among us, and their plan was meticulous but flawed. The poison in the brandy was a precaution, but the letter opener was the true weapon. The note was forged to cast suspicion on Grey himself. The scarf was placed in the conservatory to implicate Mademoiselle Marlowe. But the killer did not account for Hercule Poirot. He turned to Lady Beatrice, whose composure had begun to crack. Madame Ashburn, you have been the gracious hostess, but you have concealed the most. Your friendship with Monsieur Gray was not as distant as you claimed. He knew of a secret in your past, a financial indiscretion, perhaps, that threatened your standing.
Mademoiselle Marlowe's scarf, which she had dropped, and hid it in the conservatory to cast suspicion. The note you forged to suggest Gray was the aggressor, but the green thread caught in the door betrayed your presence. The room was silent, save for Lady Beatrice's sharp intake of breath. "You have no proof," she whispered. Poirot's eyes were like twin flames. "The proof is in the details. The servant saw you leave the ballroom at 10 minutes to midnight. The thread matches your gown, not just the scarf. And the handwriting of the note, it bears the flourish of your own, found in the speech you prepared for the evening. You killed Lawrence Gray to protect your secret, and you used the chaos of the masquerade to cover your crime." Lady Beatrice rose, her face a mask of fury and fear. "No, I won't listen to this!" But Poirot's voice was inexorable. "You cannot escape the truth, madame. The police will confirm the poison, the handwriting, the thread. Confess, and spare yourself further disgrace." With a cry, Lady Beatrice sank back into her chair, her hands covering her face. "He was going to ruin me," she whispered. "He knew about the embezzlement years ago. I couldn't let him destroy everything." The room erupted in gasps and murmurs, but Poirot's gaze remained steady. "The trap is sprung, mes amis. The truth is revealed." Hastings, his heart pounding, scribbled the final notes, marveling at Poirot's genius. The mystery of Blackthorn Hall was solved, and the killer unmasked, all through the power of the little grey cells. The drawing room of Blackthorn Hall, once a stage for elegance and festivity, now bore the weight of a grim resolution. Lady Beatrice Ashbourne sat crumpled in her chair, her face buried in her hands, the confession of her crime hanging in the air like a mournful echo. The other guests, stunned into silence, stared at her with a mixture of shock and pity, their own secrets and suspicions laid bare by the relentless logic of Hercule Poirot. Captain Arthur Hastings, his notebook filled with the frantic scribbles of the past hour, felt a strange mix of triumph and melancholy. The mystery was solved, the killer unmasked, but the cost of truth was a heavy one. Poirot stood before the fireplace, his small figure radiating a quiet dignity, his eyes softened by a touch of sadness. The firelight cast flickering shadows across his face, accentuating the neat curve of his moustache and the sharp intelligence in his gaze. He clasped his hands behind his back, his voice low but resonant as he addressed the assembly one final time. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, "the affair of Blackthorn Hall is concluded. Equine took the life. The poisoned brandy, the forged note, the mislaid scarf. But the power of life, little grey cells of Hercule Poirot are not so easily deceived." Lady Beatrice raised her head, her eyes red-rimmed but defiant. "You don't understand, Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice trembling. "He would have destroyed me, my family, everything I've built. That scandal, it was a youthful mistake long buried. But Lawrence, he was merciless. He would have exposed me to the world." Poirot's expression was one of measured compassion. "Madame, I understand the fear of ruin. But to take a life, this is a crime that cannot be undone. The truth, it is not a weapon to be wielded for vengeance, but a light to guide us to justice." He turned to the others, his gaze sweeping over their pale faces. "Each of you carried secrets, and each of you felt the shadow of Monsieur Gray's knowledge. Mademoiselle Marlowe, your theft, though small, was a wound to your pride. Monsieur Trent, your financial dealings were less than honorable. Madame Carver, your humiliation at Gray's hands lingered like a scar. Sir Reginald,
Your legal disputes were a source of bitterness. Dr. Everett, your professional ethics were questioned. Madame Lang, your beliefs were mocked. But none of you resorted to murder. That choice was Madame Ashburn's alone. Violet Marlowe, clutching Julian Trent's hand, spoke softly.
I thought it was my fault, that my secret drove someone to kill him. I'm so sorry, Lady Beatrice.
Lady Beatrice's lips trembled, but she said nothing, her gaze fixed on the floor. Julian Trent's face was tight with anger, but he remained silent, his arm around Violet a gesture of protection rather than accusation. Dr. Malcolm Everett leaned back in his chair, his expression one of detached curiosity. A fascinating study in human nature, Monsieur Poirot. You've unmasked not just a killer, but the frailties we all carry. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. Oui, doctor, but it is not enough to observe. One must act with justice and with mercy. The police, when they arrive, will take Madame Ashburn into custody. But let this be a lesson. The truth, it will always find its way. As the guests absorbed his words, the distant sound of gravel crunching under wheels signaled the arrival of the police, their delay finally overcome by the clearing roads. The room stirred, but Poirot raised a hand. One moment, mes amis. Before we part, allow Hercule Poirot to reflect. The human heart, it is a complex thing, capable of great love and great cruelty. In this case, it was fear that drove Madame Ashburn, fear of shame, of loss, of judgment. But fear, it is a poor master. It leads to invaluable. What do you make of this affair? Hastings closed his notebook, his voice low. It's a tragedy, Poirot. Lady Beatrice seemed so composed, so in control. To think she was hiding such a secret, and that it led to murder, it's chilling. Poirot nodded. Oui, Hastings. The mask of composure, it is often the most fragile. But now the mask is removed, and we see the truth. The police entered, led by a stern inspector who listened as Poirot recounted the evidence. The green thread matching Lady Beatrice's gown, the forged note in her handwriting, the poisoned brandy, the scarf placed to implicate Violet Marlowe. Lady Beatrice, her defiance spent, rose and allowed herself to be led away, her head bowed but her steps steady. The other guests watched in silence, their own burdens lightened by the resolution, yet heavier for the knowledge of human frailty. As the police secured the library and began their formal investigation, Poirot and Hastings retreated to the conservatory, where the air was thick with the scent of ferns and earth. The detective sipped a tisane, his expression one of quiet contemplation. Poirot, Hastings said, how did you know it was Lady Beatrice? The scarf pointed to Violet, and the note suggested Grey was the aggressor. It all seemed so convoluted. Poirot's eyes twinkled. The convolution, mon ami, was the killer's mistake. The scarf was too convenient, the note too deliberate. But the green thread, it matched Madame Ashbourne's gown, not just the scarf. And her handwriting, it betrayed her in the flourish of the L on the note. The poison? It was a sign of her uncertainty. She feared the stab would not suffice. These details, they told the story the killer could not hide. Hastings shook his head, marveling. You make it sound so simple, but it's genius, Poirot. You saw what none of us could. Poirot's smile was modest. The little grey cells, they see what the heart obscures. But now, Hastings, we must leave this place. The moors, they are too wild for Hercule Poirot. I long for the order of London.
the comfort of my flat." As they prepared to depart, the guests gathered to bid them farewell, their expressions a mix of gratitude and relief. Violet Marlowe, her face still pale, clasped Poirot's hand. "Thank you, Monsieur Poirot. You saved me from suspicion, and perhaps from myself." Poirot bowed slightly. "Mademoiselle, live honestly, and the shadows will not haunt you." The Bentley awaited to carry them back to the station, and as Blackthorn Hall receded into the mist, Hastings felt the weight of the case lift, replaced by a quiet awe for him.
Sometimes it is only by seeing the script clearly that we avoid a tragedy. With that, the little Belgian detective fell silent, and Hastings knew that Blackthorn Hall would remain a chapter in the long story of Poirot's triumphs, a testament to the power of the little gray cells. Chapter 12. The Echoes of Truth. The departure of Lady Beatrice Ashbourne, in the custody of the police, cast a somber pall over Blackthorn Hall, as though the manor itself mourned the loss of its mistress. The guests, now released from the immediate threat of suspicion, lingered in the drawing-room, their conversations subdued, their eyes haunted by the revelations of the past hours. Captain Arthur Hastings, gathering his belongings in preparation for the journey back to London, felt a curious mix of relief and disquiet. The mystery was solved, the killer unmasked, but the echoes of Lawrence Gray's murder reverberated through the house, stirring questions that lingered like the mist over the moors. Hercule Poirot, ever the picture of composure, stood by the grand staircase, adjusting his hat with meticulous care. His small, neat figure seemed almost out of place amidst the grandeur of the hall. Yet his presence was a steadying force, a reminder that order had been restored. Hastings approached, his suitcase in hand, and noted the faint melancholy in his friend's eyes. "Poirot," Hastings said, "you've done it again. Lady Beatrice's confession, the way you pieced it all together, it was extraordinary. But I can't help feeling there's more to this than we've uncovered. Why did she hide the scarf so carelessly? And the poison, why use it if the stab was enough?" Poirot's lips curved in a faint smile, but his gaze was distant. "Mon ami, your questions are astute, as always. The mind of the criminal, it is not always as precise as Hercule Poirot's. Madame Ashbourne's actions were driven by fear, and fear makes one clumsy. The scarf, it was hidden in haste, meant to divert suspicion to Mademoiselle Marlowe. The poison, it was a precaution, a sign of her uncertainty. But come, let us walk the grounds one last time before we depart. The air, it will clear the mind." They stepped onto the terrace, where the late afternoon sun struggled to pierce the mist. The moors stretched endlessly before them, their wild beauty a stark contrast to the calculated drama within the manor. Poirot paused by the balustrade, his eyes scanning the lawn where the French doors of the library opened. The green thread, now safely stored with the police, had been the linchpin of his case, but Hastings sensed that Poirot was not entirely at ease. "You're troubled, Poirot," Hastings ventured. "Is there something we missed?" Poirot's fingers drummed lightly on the stone balustrade. "Not missed, Hastings, but perhaps not fully explored. The motives of the others, they are not without weight. Mademoiselle Marlowe's secret, Monsieur Trent's financial
Troubles, Madame Carver's humiliation, these were real, and they fueled Madame Ashbourne's deception. She knew their weaknesses and used them to obscure her own crime." Hastings frowned. "You mean she deliberately played on their fears to make them seem guilty?" "Précisément," Poirot said. "Madame Ashbourne was a woman of intelligence, but her heart was ruled by desperation. She invited Monsieur Gray not merely to silence him, but to create a stage where suspicion could fall on others. The masquerade, the game of secrets, it was all part of her design to muddy the waters." They walked toward the conservatory, where the green silk scarf had been found, its delicate folds now a relic of the crime. Poirot paused by the fern, where it had been hidden, his eyes narrowing. This scarf, it was a clever touch, but not clever enough. Madame Ashbourne underestimated the little grey cells. She thought to blame Mademoiselle Marlowe, but she did not account for the thread in the door which matched her own gown. Hastings shook his head. "It's chilling, Poirot.
To think she planned it all so carefully, yet made such mistakes.
Poirot's smile was wry. The criminal mind, Hastings, it is a paradox. It plans with precision, yet it falters under pressure. Madame Ashburn's fear of exposure drove her to murder, but it also led to her undoing. The note, the poison, the scarf, these were her attempts to control the narrative, but they betrayed her. As they returned to the house, they encountered Violet Marlowe, who stood in the hall, her face pale but composed. She approached Poirot, her voice soft but steady.
Monsieur Poirot, I wanted to thank you again. If you hadn't seen through the scarf, I might have been arrested. I feel so foolish for letting Lawrence's threats control me.
Poirot bowed slightly. Mademoiselle, the past is a heavy burden, but it need not define you. Live with honesty, and you will find peace. Violet's eyes glistened with tears, but she nodded.
I'll try. And Julian, he's promised to help me start anew. We're leaving for London tomorrow.
Poirot's expression softened. Bon, the future, it is yours to shape. Inside, the other guests were preparing to depart, their bags packed, their faces marked by the ordeal. Sir Reginald and Clara Carver stood together, their earlier tension replaced by a quiet solidarity. Dr. Malcolm Everett, ever the observer, offered Poirot a nod of respect. You've a remarkable mind, Monsieur Poirot. I'd have liked to study it. Poirot's eyes twinkled. Doctor, the mind of Hercule Poirot is not for dissection. It is for solving the puzzles of the human heart. Mrs. Dorothea Lang, her rings clinking, approached with a hesitant smile. Monsieur Poirot, my cards were right about danger, but I never imagined this. You've brought light to a dark place.
Banish the shadows. As the guests dispersed, Julian Trent lingered, his expression a mix of gratitude and unease. Poirot, I owe you for clearing Violet's name, but I'll admit I'm shaken. Gray's threats about my business, they weren't entirely baseless. I'll be more careful in the future. Poirot's gaze was piercing. Monsieur, honesty in business, as in life, is the only path to true security. With the guests departing and the police concluding their work, Poirot and Hastings prepared to board the Bentley for the station. The manor loomed behind them, its towers stark against the fading light. Hastings glanced back, a shiver running through him. It's a beautiful place, Poirot, but I'll be glad to leave it behind. Too many shadows. Poirot nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Oui, Hastings, but shadows exist only where there is light. And the light of truth, it has prevailed. As the car pulled away, the moors stretched endlessly before them, their wildness a reminder of the untamed passions that had led to murder. Poirot leaned back, his hands folded neatly, his mind already turning to the next challenge. The world, mon ami, it is full of mysteries. But with method and the little grey cells, there is no puzzle that cannot be solved. Hastings smiled, comforted by his friend's unshakable confidence. Blackthorn Hall would fade into memory, but the brilliance of Hercule Poirot would endure, a beacon of reason in a world of chaos. Chapter 13. The Ripples of Resolution. The Bentley glided smoothly along the winding roads that led away from Blackthorn Hall, its engine a low hum against the vast silence of the Devon moors. The mist had begun to lift, revealing patches of heather and gorse that shimmered in the late afternoon light. But the weight of the recent tragedy lingered in the air. Captain Arthur Hastings, seated beside Hercule Poirot, gazed out at the passing landscape, his mind still tangled in the web of secrets and betrayal that had unraveled within the manor's walls. The resolution of Lawrence Gray's murder had brought clarity, but it had also left a residue of unease, like dust settling after a storm. Poirot, impeccable as ever in his tailored suit, sat with his hands folded neatly in his lap, his eyes half closed, as if in meditation. Yet Hastings knew better than to mistake this for idleness. The little Belgian detective's mind was never at rest, even after a case was solved. The green thread, the poisoned brandy.
About the other guests, perhaps? Poirot's eyes opened, a faint twinkle in their depths.
Mon ami, you are perceptive as always.
The case, it is closed, and Madame Ashburn's guilt is certain. But the human heart, it is a labyrinth, and in every labyrinth there are paths unexplored. The others, Trent, Marlowe, the Carvers, Everett, Lang, they all carried secrets that made them vulnerable. Madame Ashburn exploited this, but it does not mean their stories are without significance. They arrived at the small wind-swept station where they had first disembarked, the platform now bustling with the arrival of a late train. As they waited, Poirot continued, his voice low and thoughtful. Consider, Hastings, the ripples of a crime. The murder of Monsieur Gray was the stone cast into the pond, but the ripples touch all who were near. Mademoiselle Marlowe, she will carry the weight of her past theft, but perhaps she will find redemption in honesty. Monsieur Trent, his business dealings will come under scrutiny, and he must choose a better path. The Carvers, their marriage strained by suspicion, must rebuild trust. Even Dr. Everett and Madame Lang, they must confront their own pride and folly. Hastings nodded, his thoughts drifting to the guests they had left behind. It's strange, Poirot. They all seemed so ordinary, yet each had something to hide. Do you think they'll learn from this? Poirot's smile was wry. The human heart, it learns slowly, mon ami, but tragedy, it is a teacher, if a harsh one. For some, the lesson will be taken to heart. For others, it will be forgotten in time. The train's whistle pierced the air, and they boarded, settling into a quiet compartment. As the countryside rolled past, Hastings reflected on the events at Blackthorn Hall. The elegance of the masquerade, the chilling discovery of Gray's body, the slow unraveling of lies, it had all unfolded like one of Gray's own plays, a drama of human weakness and cunning. Yet it was Poirot's clarity, his unerring focus on the truth, that had brought the curtain down. Poirot, Hastings said, you mentioned the ripples of the crime. Do you think Lady Beatrice's actions will have consequences beyond her arrest? For the manor? For her family? Poirot's eyes narrowed, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest. Oui, Hastings, Blackthorn Hall, it will bear the stain of this tragedy. The Ashbourne name, once a symbol of prestige, will now be whispered with scandal. Her family, if she has any, will face the burden of her shame. But such is the nature of crime. It does not end with the act, but continues to echo through the lives it touches.
He said. She thought she could control the narrative, like one of Gray's plays. But you saw through it. Poirot's smile was modest. The little Gray cells, they are the audience that cannot be deceived. Madame Ashburn wrote her script with care, but she forgot that truth is the harshest critic. The green thread, it was her fatal error, not the scarf, but the thread from her own gown, caught in the hinge of the French doors. It placed her at the scene, and her handwriting on the note sealed her fate. The train rattled on, carrying them closer to London, where the familiar comforts of Poirot's flat awaited.
Hastings glanced at his friend, who seemed lost in thought, his eyes fixed on the passing fields. "What now, Poirot? Back to London? To your tisanes and your orderly life?" Poirot chuckled softly. "Oui, mon ami. The moors, they are too wild for Hercule Poirot. I long for the symmetry of my apartment, the precision of my routine. But the world, it will not let us rest for long. There are always mysteries, always secrets waiting to be uncovered." As the train pulled into the station, the bustle of London greeted them, a stark contrast to the brooding isolation of Blackthorn Hall. They stepped onto the platform, and Poirot adjusted his hat, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. "Hastings," he said, "this case, it reminds us that the human heart is both the source of crime and the key to its solution. We must listen to it, but we must also question it." Hastings nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. "You're a philosopher as much as a detective, Poirot. I don't know how you do it." Poirot's eyes twinkled. "With method, mon ami, and with the little grey cells. Come, let us find a taxi. London awaits, and perhaps another puzzle." As they stepped into the city's embrace, Blackthorn Hall faded into memory, a chapter closed but not forgotten. The echoes of Lawrence Gray's murder would linger, but for now the truth had prevailed, and Hercule Poirot's genius had once again brought light to the darkness. Chapter 14. The Shadows of Departure. The London skyline emerged through the train's window as the last rays of daylight painted the horizon in hues of amber and grey. Captain Arthur Hastings, seated across from Hercule Poirot in their quiet compartment, felt the weight of Blackthorn Hall receding with each mile, yet the case lingered in his mind, like a half-remembered dream. The unmasking of Lady Beatrice Ashbourne as Lawrence Gray's murderer had been a triumph of logic, but it had also exposed the fragility of human pride and the lengths to which fear could drive a soul. Hastings glanced at Poirot, who such a crime, and with such calculation, it's hard to reconcile. Poirot turned, his eyes gleaming with a quiet intensity. "Mon ami, the heart, it is a paradox. It can be both noble and base, capable of great kindness and great cruelty. Madame Ashbourne's refinement was her mask, but beneath it lay a fear so profound that it led to murder. This is why Hercule Poirot trusts not the surface, but the truth beneath." The train slowed as it approached Paddington Station, the bustle of the platform a stark contrast to the brooding isolation of the moors. As they disembarked, Poirot adjusted his hat with his usual precision, his movements a reminder of his unyielding need for order. Hastings, carrying their bags, followed his friend through the crowd, his thoughts still tangled in the details of the case. "Do you think, Poirot," he ventured as they hailed a taxi, "that there was more to Lady Beatrice's motive? The embezzlement, yes, but it feels incomplete. Why risk everything for a scandal from years ago?" Poirot settled into the taxi, his hands folded neatly. "An excellent question, Hastings. The embezzlement was the spark, but the fire was her pride. Madame Ashbourne was not merely protecting her fortune, but her place in society, her legacy. Monsieur Gray, with his sharp tongue and sharper mind, threatened to tear down the edifice she had built. To her, that was a fate worse than death." The taxi wound through London streets, the familiar sights of gaslights and bustling crowds a welcome return to normalcy. Yet Hastings could not shake the image of Blackthorn Hall, its ivy-clad towers looming in the mist. "And the others," he said. "Violet, Trent, the Carvers. Do you think they'll recover from this?" Poirot's smile was wistful. "Recovery, mon ami, is a journey, not a destination.
Mademoiselle Marlowe and Monsieur Trent. They may find strength in their shared truth, but they must confront their own weaknesses. The Carvers, their trust shaken, will need time to heal. Dr. Everett and Madame Lang, they will continue to observe and to dream, but perhaps with less arrogance. The ripples of this crime will touch them all, but life, it moves forward. They arrived at Poirot's flat, a haven of order and comfort that stood in stark contrast to the chaos of Blackthorn Hall. The sitting room, with its polished furniture and neatly arranged books, welcomed them like an old friend. Poirot set about preparing a tisane, his movements precise, while Hastings sank into an armchair, his mind still turning over the case. "Poirot," he said, "the green thread, the forged note, the poisoned brandy, you saw through it all. But what if Lady Beatrice hadn't made those mistakes? Could she have escaped justice?" Poirot paused, the teapot in hand, his eyes distant. No one is
Mere chance. They were the cracks in her facade, the signs of her desperation. The green thread from her gown, caught in the hinge, was a whisper of her presence. The note, with its flourish, was a signature she could not erase. The poison, unnecessary for a fatal stab, was her fear made manifest. These were not accidents, but the truth asserting itself. Hastings nodded, marveling at his friend's clarity. "You make it sound almost inevitable, as if the truth always finds a way." Poirot's eyes twinkled as he poured the tisane. "It does, mon ami. The little grey cells, they are the servants of truth, and truth is a relentless master. But enough of this case. Let us enjoy the peace of London, the symmetry of my flat. The moors, they are too wild for Hercule Poirot." They sat in companionable silence, the warmth of the tisane and the familiarity of the room easing the lingering shadows of Blackthorn Hall. Yet Hastings knew that Poirot's mind was never truly at rest. The detective's gaze drifted to the window, where the lights of London glimmered against the gathering dusk. "Poirot," Hastings said, "do you ever tire of it? The mysteries, the crimes, the endless parade of human weakness?" Poirot's smile was gentle, almost philosophical. "Tire, Hastings? None. The mysteries, they are the pulse of life. Each case is a puzzle, each puzzle a challenge to the order I cherish. And in solving them, I restore a little of that order to the world. It is not a burden, but a calling." Hastings leaned back, a smile tugging at his lips. "You're a remarkable man, Poirot. I don't know how you do it, case after case, always finding the truth." Poirot raised his cup in a small toast. "With method, mon ami, and with the little grey cells, and with friends like you who keep me grounded." As the evening settled over London, the memory of Blackthorn Hall began to fade, its tragedy a chapter closed in the long story of Poirot's triumphs. The green thread, the forged note, the poisoned brandy, all were now part of the tapestry of justice woven by the unerring hand of Hercule Poirot. Tomorrow, there would be new puzzles, new secrets, but for now the little Belgian detective savored the quiet victory of truth. Chapter 15. The Final Curtain. The soft glow of gaslights illuminated the familiar streets of London as Hercule Poirot's flat welcomed Captain Arthur Hastings with its comforting order and warmth. The events at Blackthorn Hall, though now a day behind them, lingered in Hastings' mind like the aftertaste of a bitter wine. The unmasking of Lady Beatrice Ashbourne as Lawrence Gray's murderer had been a triumph of Poirot's genius, yet it left a residue of melancholy, a reminder of the fragility of human virtue.
With its polished surfaces and neatly arranged books, was a stark contrast to the brooding grandeur of Blackthorn Hall. The memory of the ivy-clad manor, its library stained with blood and secrets, seemed almost a dream now. Yet the details, the green thread, the poisoned brandy, the forged note, remained vivid in Hastings' thoughts. He glanced at Poirot,
who was adjusting the position of a porcelain cup with the care of an artist perfecting a canvas. "Poirot," Hastings said, breaking the comfortable silence. "This case at Blackthorn Hall, it's one for the books. The way you unraveled Lady Beatrice's scheme, turning her own clues against her, it was masterful. But I can't help feeling there's something unresolved. Did we truly uncover all there was to know?" Poirot's eyes twinkled as he settled into the opposite armchair, his tisane steaming gently. "Mon ami, you have the heart of a true detective, always seeking the final piece of the puzzle. The case, it is closed. Madame Ashbourne's guilt is beyond doubt. The green thread from her gown, the flourish of her handwriting on the forged note, the trace of cyanide in the brandy, these were the threads that wove her downfall. Yet you are right to sense a shadow. Every crime leaves echoes, questions that linger beyond the verdict." Hastings leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean, Poirot? Are you saying there's more to the story?" Poirot's smile was enigmatic, his fingers steepled as he considered his words. "Not more to the crime, Hastings, but to the human tapestry it revealed. Madame Ashbourne acted alone, driven by her fear of exposure. But the others, Violet Marlowe, Julian Trent, the Carvers, Dr. Everett, Mrs. Lang, they were not mere bystanders. Their secrets, their fears, they fueled her plan. She knew their weaknesses and used them to create a stage of suspicion. A masquerade within the masquerade." Hastings nodded, his mind drifting to the guests they had left behind. Violet's confession about her theft, Trent's shady dealings, Clara's humiliation, they all played into her hands. It's almost as if Lady Beatrice orchestrated a play of her own, with Gray as the tragic hero. "Précisément," Poirot said, his voice soft but resonant. "Madame Ashbourne was a director of deception, casting each guest in a role to divert suspicion. The scarf, placed in the conservatory, was meant to implicate Mademoiselle Marlowe. The note, forged with Gray's initials, suggested he was the aggressor. The poison, an unnecessary flourish, revealed her uncertainty. But she did not account for Hercule Poirot, who sees the script behind the performance." Hastings took a sip of his whiskey, savoring its warmth. "And yet, Poirot, she seemed so—"
The human heart, it is a complex thing. Madame Ashbourne's crime was born of fear, but also of pride, of a life built on appearances. When that life crumbled, so too did her resolve. Regret, it comes too late for justice, but it is a reminder that even the guilty are human. The clock on the mantel chimed softly, marking the hour, and Hastings felt a sense of closure settling over him. "What will happen to her, do you think? And to Blackthorn Hall?" Poirot sipped his tisane, his eyes distant. "Madame Ashbourne will face the law, and the law is not kind to murderers, even those of refinement. As for Blackthorn Hall, it will stand, but it will carry the stain of this tragedy. The Moors, they do not forget, and neither does society. The Ashbourne name will be whispered with sorrow, and the matter may fade into a relic of scandal." Hastings shook his head, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "It's a grim end to what started as a festive gathering. A Halloween masquerade turned into a murder mystery. It's like something out of one of Gray's plays." Poirot chuckled softly. "Indeed, mon ami. Monsieur Gray, he would have appreciated the irony. His life, it was a drama, and his death, a final act. But it is not the drama that matters, but the truth that emerges from it." They sat in companionable silence, the crackle of the fire filling the room with a gentle warmth. Hastings' thoughts drifted to the guests, now scattered back to their lives. Violet Marlowe and Julian Trent, perhaps finding a new beginning in their shared vulnerability. The Carvers, grappling with the cracks in their marriage. Dr. Everett, observing the world with his clinical detachment.
Mrs. Lang, seeking meaning in her cards. Each had been touched by the crime, their lives altered by the ripples of truth.
Poirot,
Hastings said at last, do you ever wonder what drives people to such extremes? Lady Beatrice, she had everything, wealth, status, a grand home. Why risk it all? Poirot's gaze was philosophical, his voice low. The heart, Hastings, it is driven by what it values most. For Madame Ashburn, it was her place in the world, her illusion of perfection. When that was threatened, she saw no other path but to destroy the threat. It is a tragedy, not only for Monsieur Gray, but for her own soul. Hastings nodded, his admiration for his friend deepening. You see so much, Poirot. Not just the clues, but the people behind them. It's what makes you, well, you. Poirot's smile was modest, but his eyes sparkled with pride. The little grey cells, mon ami, they see what others overlook. But they are guided by a belief in order, in justice, in the truth that sets us free, even when it wounds. As the evening deepened, Poirot rose, his movements brisk. Come, Hastings, let us dine. The mysteries of London await.
Served. Hastings followed, a smile breaking through his melancholy. Blackthorn Hall was behind them, its shadows banished by the light of Poirot's genius. The world would turn, new puzzles would arise, but for now, the curtain had fallen on this tragedy, and the little Belgian detective stood ready for whatever act would follow.